Okay, so now we're back to this discussion, and we've looked at these issues of the self and nature, the self and society, and now we're going to talk about Marx and this connection between the self and the worker. So people have probably heard of Karl Marx, but I'll just put his name on the board, so you're familiar with it. Karl Marx, founder of Big Communist Idea, co-author of the Communist Manifesto, founder of Marxism, etc. All right. When we're talking about Marx, we need to do some history a little bit to see what he's talking about in terms of the way people used to work, the way they used to live, and how that changed with the Industrial Revolution, and how that led to a lot of the problems that he's trying to analyze. So, Marx contends that in the Middle Ages and onward, for the most part, a lot of people were able to work as craftsmen to some extent. And what does that mean? Well, let's take an example of somebody who works as a farmer. This is somebody who has a little bit of land, somebody who is responsible for planting the seeds, for tilling the soil, removing the weeds, harvesting the crop, and then either consuming the crop or selling it at the end. Craftsman is somebody who takes ownership over the entire process of production, from getting the means of production, to getting the tools, to starting the labor for it, to working through on it, to putting all the parts together, to finishing it, to refining it, to marketing it, to selling it, and then even repairing it, okay? So somebody who works as a blacksmith is somebody who might be part of this too. He's responsible for making tools and instruments other people will use. A carpenter is another craftsman, somebody who uses wood and lumber to build material, but who's responsible for making the wood to be such that it can be used for building, who puts it together, who takes ownership over this entire process, okay? So, Marx saw this, he looked at people, labor as something that was primarily about craftsmanship, okay? So that's another term to look at. All right, and another thing to note about the craftsman is that it's somebody who takes responsibility for his work and takes pride in it. He can say of the finished product, this is my own. I'm the one who made this. I want it to be good. I have to put my stamp of approval to it. And if I'm selling it to somebody, my reputation as a craftsman is on the line, and therefore I want it to be the best possible work. The person is going to take a lot of pride in it. He's also going to take a lot of meaning in it. He puts a lot of his time in. He can see the whole product. He can see the ways in which he could improve on it. He can see perhaps how when he sells it, it helps other people out. He can see the money that he's made for it or the reputation that he gets from it. He finds that this is meaningful labor that he takes responsibility for himself. No one is forcing him to do it. He's the one who chooses a certain craft that he adopts and that he tries to work as best as possible. And again, we can think of somebody like a farmer, a cobbler, a blacksmith, somebody who works hard, but is in charge of his labor, is in charge of how he does it, is in charge of getting the products that he needs, etc. So every step along the way, right, from getting the material to the finished product, this laborer is working hard on every single step along that way, and he's the one responsible for it, and he's taking ownership of it. All right, another word you could use here is there's an integrity to his work. His work holds together. He is involved in every part of it. He's not having anybody else come in and do the work for him. He's not trying to be lazy about any part of the work. It's integral. It holds together because it's his labor with his work put into it, with his effort, with his intelligence, with his creativity behind it. Creativity is here actually an important term because the craftsman is like an artist. He has to be creative. He has to use his own skills, his own understanding in order to make the product well. He can't rely on anybody else. He's in charge from the beginning until the end. It's the buck stops with him. He's the one who has to make sure that this product is made well. All right. Now, one of the things, according to Marx, that happens is that with industrialization and the Industrial Revolution, there becomes an emphasis on making products faster, more efficient, and making more and more of these products that are kind of generally the same that everybody will want. All right, let's get more specific with this, okay? So a cobbler is somebody who works on shoes. And in a small village, he'd be the one who would make and repair the shoes. But as the Industrial Revolution starts to take hold, people realize, well, wait a minute, that factory over there, that can make 50 pairs of shoes faster than this cobbler can make 10 pairs of shoes. And they're selling them at a cheaper rate, and everybody's buying them. So I'm going to get the factory-made one because it's cheaper, it's more efficient, it's what everybody's doing. So pretty soon that cobbler is going to be out of business. He can't compete with that sort of efficiency, those low prices, and that desire for sort of a general type of thing that everybody wants. Again, the craftsman is specific. He makes a specific type of material, a specific object in his particular form. He puts his particular unique stamp to that work. But when you have people wanting the same kind of fashion, wanting the same type of thing, they don't want the particular unique stamp of a craftsman. What they want is a generic model, a generic type. And Marx says this is what starts to happen. People get desirous of these generic type of things, be it shoes, be it houses, be it clothes, etc. So somebody who used to work as a seamstress, for example, making clothes, is now also out of business. Why? Because she can't compete with the dress factories. They make it more efficient. They make that generic type that everybody's getting. So eventually, Marx says, the craftsman, the individual laborer who is in charge of his own work from beginning to end, that prospect becomes less and less available. More and more people aren't able to do that. They're going to have to start working in a factory. So, in a sense, Marx is getting at what we see in places, what we saw in places like England and France especially, where men, women, children, etc., in order to survive, in order to make money, start having to join this factory system. They have to start becoming workers in the factory. Whereas previous generations would have worked from home and would have been craftsmen on their own, now, in the 1800s and onward, Marx is saying, people have to join up with a factory system. They have to go to work outside of home and do a job at a factory in order to make enough money to survive. All right. Now the next point I'm going to put up here is a very important term for Marx. It's called the distribution of labor. Okay, so the distribution of labor idea is the opposite of what we saw with the craftsman. With the craftsman, the farmer was the one who got the seeds, planted them in the soil, tilled that soil, etc. His labor was his alone. Making food, growing crops belonged to him and only to him. With the distribution of labor, however, the labor of making something is now distributed among a wide variety of people. For example, at a factory, you first of all would have all those people who made the machines that would go into the factory. So that labor is distributed. Then you'd have all the people who brought those machines to the factory. That labor is distributed. Then you'd have the raw material, okay, whether it be metal, whether it be fabric, whatever it is, that's coming from outside. So that labor has been distributed. And then at a factory, think of an assembly line. People are doing individual tasks, okay? So let's go with the cobbler. Now, previously, somebody who worked as a cobbler was in charge of making the entire shoe, all right? Now, once this guy, say, loses his job and has to go work at a factory, and under this distribution of labor system, now what he's doing, instead of making the entire shoe and being in charge of that whole process, now what he's doing is, say, he's just putting in the sole of the shoe, all right? He's just doing one tiny part, and then he hands that off to somebody else who does more to complete it. He has no say over the material. He has no say over where the material comes from. He has no say over the other parts of the shoe. He just has one very limited, very specific role to play in the production of it. So that labor has now been distributed among all sorts of people and in different places. Okay, so in a sense, what's going on here is that workers become like cogs in a machine. They become almost interchangeable one with the other, okay? Now, suppose you have a broken part in a car. Suppose your brakes aren't working. Well, what do? You go and get new brakes, and your car works just as fine. Okay? So suppose then the suspension goes, well, you go and get new struts for it. The wheel becomes, the tires become bald, you get new tires. So you just take one part out and you put in a new one. And the whole machine, the whole car works well. Marx is saying something similar is happening with this factory system, this distribution of labor, okay? So each individual laborer is like an individual part of a car now. They're not in charge of the whole car. Rather, the factory owners and the owners of the material are in charge of the car. They're in charge of the whole factory, the whole system, okay? Now, Marx termed these people the bourgeoisie. They're the people who owned most of the capital and the resources in the factories, all right? Now, let's go back to this analogy again. The car is like the factory, okay? So the driver of the car are the people who direct where the car is going to go and what it's going to do. The people who own the car and own the factory, those are the bourgeoisie. People with all the money, they own the factories, they own the natural resources that are used in the factories, they own the railways where the factory's goods are, on which the factory's goods are shipped. Okay? So the factories like the car, the owners of the car like the bourgeoisie, the ones with all the capital and the resources, and then the workers are like the parts of that car. And again, if you have a part that's not working, the tire goes flat, you just take it out and put in another one. Okay? So if you have a worker who's not fast enough, who's not efficient enough, who's not doing his job well enough, boom, he's gone. So let's go back to this cobbler. Previously, this cobbler could make an entire shoe with his own unique stamp in a creative, almost artistic fashion. Now his job is just to kind of mindlessly, in a rote, continuous fashion, pound in the sole of shoes that he has no say over their entire process. Maybe he gets bored with his job. Maybe he finds it meaningless. Maybe he finds it just degrading. Doesn't work hard. That doesn't matter for the system, right? They can just exchange him out and bring in somebody else who will do that job just as well. Because again, it's a fairly menial, easy task. This is something to emphasize. I need to pinpoint on. Okay, the fact is that the artisan craftsman had to be fairly artistic. He had to be creative. He had to be pretty intelligent. He had to think deeply in a way about his job. But now there's not a lot of thought, artistry, and creativity that's required. You're just doing a small, menial part of this distributed labor. You're just pounding in a nail, okay? Or say the distributed labor has to do with a farmer's field, whereas previously the farmer was in charge of the entire labor. Now someone's job just is to just drop seeds into the ground, okay? That's it. He doesn't even know maybe what these seeds are. He doesn't know when the proper season is to grow them. He's just told to go out and do it. So he's not able to exercise intelligence, creativity, a real awareness about it. He almost becomes like an automaton, somebody who just does something over and over and again without thinking about it. Okay, so we have this situation now with the factory situation and the distribution of labor where workers become interchangeable, where their work is isolated, where they're not we have a distribution of labor where the workers are doing kind of menial, rote, mindless tasks over and over and over again. We've lost the integrity of the previous craftsman era. We've lost the ability to be artistic. And Marx then continues with this, and he comes up with something that's perhaps a little bit controversial, but I think interesting. So what Marx says is that previously the craftsman was his own boss. He wasn't owned by anyone. Now, in the factory system, somebody has to basically sell himself, sell his labor to a company in order to make money. He now becomes obedient to and subservient to that company and plays that role within the company in order to make the money necessary for him and his family to survive. So Marx is contending that the company now almost takes ownership over the person. So not only have they taken ownership over the entire process of the product being made, of the thing being made, now they also have ownership over the person, who becomes what Marx calls a wage slave. All right, so this is just another thing to think about with Marx. He calls this a wage slave, somebody who chooses to make himself almost a slave of a company in order to make a living wage. He sells his ability to work, his labor, in order to belong to the company that will then provide him the means necessary to survive. All right. Now, one of the other things with Marx that we should look at is the impersonal nature of the factory system, right? So again, previously, a craftsman would have a personal connection to the people with whom he worked, the people who bought his product. Why? Because he was in charge of every step of the product being made. So, for example, when that cobbler had finished his shoe, he sold it to somebody in his village. And if he made a bad shoe, that person would tell other people and his reputation would go down the drain. So he's going to want to make sure that he does a good job. Maybe also he is friends with people and he doesn't want to sell them a shoddy product. He wants to sell them a good product. And likewise, the customers are going to learn to trust him if they know him on a personal level, if they've done business with him before. So there's this personal connections that are involved in the craftsman's work. Okay? He relates to people, he sells them products, they buy from him, they know each other on a personal level, there's a level of trust, there's a level of cooperation, etc. Now Marx says that kind of goes out the window with the industrialization and the factory system. Now people work for a company and they'll never know who the boss is. They'll never know most of their other workers there. They'll just go in and do this job over and over and over again. Okay? They'll never know the people who bought the product. They'll never know the people who sold the material to make this product. They'll never have a personal bond with any of that. So Marx emphasizes the lack of personal touch, the facelessness, if you will, of the Industrial Revolution. How we work for a nameless, faceless company and become almost like a number for that company. So rather than being Fred the cobbler who made the good shoes and was friends with everybody in the village, now somebody is just number 16 who's working on the assembly line to make X type of shoes, and that's it. So the person's identity now becomes very much decreased. It becomes almost set in this limited mode of acting within this factory system. The person just becomes, like I said earlier, a number almost. Just there to perform this sort of mindless, rote, menial task of pounding in nails to a shoe. So what Marx says is that the identity of people becomes very limited in this industrialization. Like I emphasized earlier, they lose creativity, they lose a sense of intelligent work behind their labor. They've lost all that. Another point that Marx makes a big deal out of is this idea of alienation. Okay. Alienation, to be cut off from, to be removed from. So in what ways does Marx think that people in the Industrial Revolution have become alienated? Well, for one, he says, they become disconnected from their community. We just saw this. They're not part of they don't work at home anymore. They don't know the people. They're not involved in selling products to the people around them. They don't have relationships with the people around them from their work. They're just going and doing this thing over and over and over again. Okay. Again, they're disconnected from their family and their home. They have to leave their home where they previously used to work. They have to leave their family and go work 8, 10, 12, 14, 16 hours a day away from that. So they're not, and there's no cell phones, there's no FaceTiming, there's no calling into home. They're totally cut off from that for a large portion of their day, each and every day. The worker is now also disconnected and alienated from the larger products. Okay, he's just playing a minuscule task in the whole work. He doesn't see the finished product. He has no responsibility for the finished product. He has no ownership over the finished product. He can't put his unique stamp, his unique. Anyway, I lost my train of thought there for a second. But he can't. It's not his anymore. So he's alienated from his work in a sense, because his work is about making a product, but now he has no relationship to that product. He's just a cog in the machine. All right? Finally, Marx says people in this situation are alienated from themselves. Seems like an odd thing to say. How can I ever be alienated from myself? Well, let's look at this from a deeper level. Some of the essential parts of what makes us human are, for example, our intelligence, our creativity, and our sense of responsibility, our sense of taking ownership over what we did. Well, as we just saw, this job doesn't really require any intelligence. It's mind-numbing, actually. So he's not operating out of his intelligence. He's not using his intelligence. His intelligence is just cut off from him. So that's the first type. That's the first part of it. He's not creative. There's no creativity in his job. To be creative is actually to act contrary to the whole assembly line factory system. That's where you just do the same thing, stamp over and over again. That's what makes it so efficient. That's what makes it so predictable. That's what allows them to make these generic products over and over again so easily and so readily. So he's called to not only not be creative, but creativity would be a problem. So he has to be cut off from his creativity. Now he's cut off from responsibility. Let's be clear about this. Previously, that cobbler was responsible for his product. He was responsible for getting it sold. He was responsible for the fact that it was good. Okay? His reputation, his work was on the line. He had to take ownership of that. He had to ensure that it worked well. Now, he's not responsible for that. He's just a number, part of a big system that's making a product. You could argue he has a limited responsibility over making one part of the shoe, but even if that screws up, somebody could fix it probably. So it's not really his reputation, it's not his labor on the line. I'd say finally too, he's alienated from himself when we discuss the question of meaning. Okay? So this is, I think, an important point to consider, that human beings are the sort of beings that want to find out about meaning. They want to live meaningful lives. We want to make sure our lives have meaning in them. We've discussed what it is like for me to live a meaningful life. What is the meaning of my life? Meaningful work is an essential element of this living a meaningful life. But it's very tough to say that somebody who's just doing the exact rote, minuscule job every day without any creativity, intelligence, and responsibility is actually performing meaningful work. So what is happening there is an alienation of the worker from meaning in his life, or at least meaning in his work. This huge arena of his life, his work, that should be filled with meaning for him. Okay, he could have previously found meaning in being able to help his neighbors because he made a good product for them. He could have previously found meaning because his artistic creativity was expressed through his labor. He could have previously found meaning because he was continuing the family heritage of being cobbler. Now all of those are cut off from him, and he becomes almost just a automaton, like I said earlier, performing a rote, mindless task. So even if he's paid, his work itself is not something that he finds meaningful. He's cut off from meaning in his work. So that is a basic overview of Marx. Marx is getting at this idea that work is really important for our identity. Okay? Human beings are, I'll put a term on this board. Okay, there's a Latin term. It's called homo faber. It means man, or humanity, the maker. Man, the doer. Man, the maker. Some faber being the root of words like fabricate, to construct, to make. Okay? So, Marx is touching on this idea that part of what it means to be human, an essential part of what it means to be human, is to be somebody who is creatively and meaningfully making things in the world. Okay, whether that is making a good home for family, making a product that will help other people, making a book that will inspire people. A huge part of what it means to be human is to follow this man, the doer, and follow that meaningfully, creatively, and well. Marx then, as we've seen, shows how there's a shift. Formerly, the craftsman could have followed this part of his humanity well and meaningfully. Now, when there's a distribution of labor, they become wage slaves, and there's this alienation, they're not able to work in a deeply human and meaningful way. This part of our identity, says Marx, this part of our identity as workers, as laborers, has now become almost meaningless, almost degrading. So Marx, though, I think is potentially relevant today. Okay? One thing I was thinking about was that, all right, we don't have as much of a factory system, but is working in a cubicle for a huge company drastically different from what Marx is describing? Is that a situation where there's also alienation and a distribution of labor such that the person loses creativity and meaning in his work? When we're looking for jobs, is the question of meaning and how meaningful this job will be just as important, if not more important, than the question of the benefits or the pay or the time off. So I think Marx is somebody who's relevant today. Again, part of who we are is this identity as homo faber. Some man, the human beings, the maker. Human beings, the worker. But we have to pause, I think, sometimes and think about what are ways in which my work is meaningful, creative, deeply and genuinely human, and what are ways in which it's basically like being a robot, an automaton, or even a wage slave. So that's it on Marx.